everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks for everybody coming. What a nice group, big group we have here today. Sorry. I'm not used to a microphone because I'm very loud anyway. So you're in for a treat today because you have Professor John Hubrechts. Had to practice saying the last name. He was a Framingham State University professor, 27 years, and just recently retired. And on that topic, I'll introduce myself. I'm Dixie Emond. I'm the Admissions and Marketing Director at Carmel Terrace. We're an independent assisted living community in Framingham. I know a lot of you I don't want to hear about that. I'm not ready for that. I get it. Nobody is, right? But some people don't want to maintain a house and all that kind of stuff. And they get lonely sometimes. You guys are definitely not lonely. Anyway, to piggyback on the retirement word, Friday's my last day at Carmel Terrace. Yay! So I get to join all of you in the retirement status. I've been there over 8 years. We're on over 25 acres. It's beautiful. It's immaculate. I'm not on commission. I don't have to sell the place. I'm biased about it because I think it's a wonderful place for people. This woman here knows a couple of my residents from Wellesley. They've been there several years, and he just recently turned 103. Yep, sharp as a tack, too, by the way. But in any event, over here on the table, I just have stuff. You can have whatever you want. I apologize for not having enough bags with me today. These are magnets. They're just the Red Sox schedules, and they're heavy. So please feel free to take some, so I don't have to take them back. In here, we don't have many of these left. They're kind of a fancy bookmark. It's brass. It does say Carmel Terrace on it, but it's a good bookmark if you want one. This is just information, and then if someone wants, they might want to think about it or call us, please let us know. I'd be remiss not to mention that St. Patrick's Manor, a skilled nursing facility, AKA nursing home that nobody likes to think about, they offer short-term rehab as well as long-term care. And sometimes people may know someone that might fall into that category, or they've unfortunately had a medical setback, gone to the hospital, and then they need short-term rehab. It's the biggest nursing home in the state. It's 303 beds. It's over 50 years there. And this year, Carmel Terrace is celebrating our 30th anniversary, okay? The last but not least, take a pen. They're not gel, so they don't bleed. These are menus, okay? I don't have a million of them, but help yourself. On one side is roast tenderloin of beef, and on the other is a salmon recipe. These are two recipes that my residents love. And so I had my chef, I begged my chef, I want your recipes. I actually wanted them for me, but I gave them out to people too. So anyway, that's my spiel, and I'll let John take it away.
All right, thank you, Dixie. Well, if you do go to Carmel Terrace, you can see me once a month because that's one of the places that I speak regularly to the residents. Thank you for inviting me today. Wellesley is kind of a special place in my heart because my wife, when we started dating, lived in Wellesley. We don't live here anymore, but that's where she lived when we got married. And beyond that, Winston Churchill was the first upper-level history class that I took all those years ago. And I had a great professor, and I probably wouldn't have become a professor myself without the professor that I had for my Churchill class many years ago. So I didn't get a chance to teach Churchill a great deal, but I'm glad I get to talk about him today because it takes me back to that time and that really great professor that I had. So as Dixie said, I'm retired from Framingham State. I was there for 27 years. I taught mostly American history, also taught Chinese history, taught Japanese history, did all kinds of other fun stuff. So let's move on and talk about Winston Churchill, one of the most important figures of the 20th century. It's hard to imagine the 20th century without Winston Churchill. He was born in 1894. And he died in 1965 at the age of 90 years old. And here are two pictures, famous pictures that you've probably all seen of Winston Churchill. The one on the left was taken during World War II, and the one on the right was taken a little bit later in life, but he still had his cigar. He went through about 10 of those a day. lived to be 90, so, who says smoking is bad for you? It's like, Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones is 80, so all the drugs he did, they can't be all bad, right? I'm joking. At any rate, Churchill lived a very long life, and he served in Parliament for about 64 years. He was first elected in 1900, and he was voted out of office for a couple of years in the 1920s, but then was reelected in the mid-20s and served until his retirement in 1964. So in round numbers, he served 62 years in Parliament and was responsible not only for leading the country through World War II, but many other important reforms that sort of get overshadowed by his service during World War II. Beyond that, he was a prolific writer. He wrote over 40 books in the course of his life. He wrote hundreds of newspaper and magazine articles, and he also won the Pulitzer Prize in 1953 for his history of World War II, his 6-volume history of World War II. So anybody read any of that? A few people have. Good for you. That's been on my to-read list for decades, and I hope to get there now that I'm retired, but haven't gotten to that yet. And he, like many public figures, has sort of two sides. There are those who love Winston Churchill, and he did a lot of wonderful, marvelous things. At the top of that list would be leading Great Britain during World War II, but like all public figures, like all people, he had his downsides as well, and things that he can get called out on, if you will. His biographers describe him as egocentric, brash, self-confident, flamboyant, excitable, self-absorbed, and self-centered. Not a ringing endorsement, but they also described him, this is a little bit more on the positive side, they also described him as brilliant and inspiring. And certainly, if you look at just that period of his life when he was prime minister from 1940 to 1945, those last two attributes are really noteworthy and appropriate. So on the credit side of what Mr. Churchill accomplished, it's hard to imagine a more inspiring prime minister during World War II than Winston Churchill, taking over when Britain was on the brink of defeat and leading Britain until 1945. Hard to imagine anyone else doing the job as well as he did. And believe it or not, he was not the first choice to be prime minister in 1940, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. He pioneered earlier in his career. This will go over good with this crowd, I hope. He pioneered the British equivalent of Social Security in the early 1900s, about 3 decades before the United States enacted Social Security. As I said, he authored hundreds of newspaper articles, magazine articles, and over 40 books, most of them on history as well. And lastly, and the list could be longer, but I got to keep it short. He was a loving husband and a doting father, albeit kind of an absentee father some of the time as well. A brief summary of some of his failures. I really think that any historian worth his or her salt, you have to look at the positive as well as the negative. You can't just focus on something really good that someone did. So on the negative side for Mr. Churchill, he was sort of, and I say sort of, responsible for one of the biggest disasters in British military history. It was the Gallipoli campaign in World War I. Does that ring any bells with anybody? A few people. This was a disaster for the Allies. And Churchill was forced out of government for a while because of his role in it. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward as well. He was always in debt because of his extravagant lifestyle. Cigars being one of his extravagances. They always had to be Cubans. He went through about 10 a day. He also had a habit of drinking very expensive champagne, very expensive wine, and very expensive brandy. And not just on Friday night after a tough week at the office. You know, is it a day of the week that ends in Y? Well, that's a good day to have a drink if you're Winston Churchill. So he pretty much always, at least according to one of his biographers, William Manchester, pretty much always had a drink at hand. But Manchester was clear to point out that they were very weak scotch and sodas that he was sipping at 10 o'clock in the morning. They weren't very strong. But beyond those habits, he also, they had a home called Chartwell that was very expensive, and he was constantly refurbishing, remodeling, building ponds to put fish in and doing all kinds of other things that were expensive. So he had a very expensive lifestyle. And part of the reason he had to write so much was because he never made enough money to pay the debts. So he was constantly in debt. His record on race relations was horrible. It was absolutely horrible. There's just no way around that. He opposed Indian independence. He opposed Irish home rule. He, according to his detractors, allowed a famine to happen in India during World War II that cost about 2 million lives. His non-detractors say, well, it was the middle of the war and the ships were needed for the war. It's one of those debates that goes back and forth. There's probably not necessarily a right or a wrong answer, but there are points on both sides of that. So he also pushed for the bombing of civilian populations during World War II in Europe, not only, especially in Germany. Not only was that deadly for the Germans, but the RAF suffered horrible losses in the bombing campaign that Churchill promoted. In terms of percentages, it was about as deadly, the RAF was about as deadly as the trenches in World War I. So that gives you just some idea of how dangerous these RAF missions were that he promoted. And then lastly, and I say this a little bit tongue-in-cheek, he didn't listen to his wife. And I say that because as the list of attributes that his biographer said, one of them was that he was impulsive and kind of self-absorbed, and people who are kind of impulsive and self-absorbed, and we've probably all been there to one degree or another a little bit in our lives, we often kind of don't make the right decisions. We get too centered on what we want rather than maybe what's best for everybody around us. And his wife, whose name was Clementine, was very good at pointing that out to him. In letters, they were frequently apart, and those letters still exist. And, she was really good at saying, Winnie, you should do this because it's the right thing to do, et cetera, et cetera. And more often than not, Winnie was more likely to say to himself, well, thanks, Clemmy, but no, I'm going to do whatever the heck it is I want to do, regardless of what you tell me to do. So that kind of summarizes everything. But now I want to turn and kind of work our way through Churchill's life and talk about his life and go into a little more detail on some of the things that I've mentioned in the opening remarks here. So as I said, Churchill was born in 1794. He was the 1894, yes, thank you. That's one of the things, I should have said that at the start. If at any time I give the absolute wrong date or say something that makes no sense, please stop me. As you can see, I'm kind of going without a net here. I'm looking at my notes back and forth, and I do occasionally make mistakes. It was always obvious on exams if I'd made a mistake. When I'd get to the first exam and I'd see the wrong date on something, and then I'd get to the second exam and I'd see the wrong date. And then the third exam, and it's like, oops, either this was a study group that got it wrong, or I got it wrong and they all wrote it down wrong. So yes, 1894, thank you. 1874. 1894 comes up in a minute, but let's move on. Okay, he was born in 1874. He was the grandson of the 7th Duke of Marlborough. He was the son of the Duke's younger son, so that meant that Winston did not have any, he was not part of the royalty. He did not get any titles or anything like that, okay? So that's a picture of him when he graduated from Sandhurst, which is the British equivalent of West Point. And this is where 1894 comes in, because he graduated from there in 1895. And on the right is a picture of Churchill. Churchill is on the far right, and his younger brother and his mother, whose name was Jenny. Winston had a very troubled relationship, I guess we could say, with his parents. It was not exactly a happy marriage. Winston's father died when Winston was 20 of complications of syphilis, and his mother was well known for having affairs with the rich and famous. She was also pretty sexually promiscuous. Rumor has it that she at one point was even having an affair with the Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII, who was Queen Victoria's son, who succeeded Queen Victoria whenever Queen Victoria died in the 1890s, I think it was, at any rate. So he didn't have a very good relationship with his parents. Both his brother Jack, that's Jack there, is just the two sons, but both Jack and Winston spoke very lovingly of their nanny, who apparently was more of a mother to them at any point than Jenny, his mom, or his father Randolph. So Winston was an indifferent student. He excelled at history and composition, which I guess isn't surprising given that most of his 40 books deal with history in some way, shape, or form. But he also had behavioral problems, was often in trouble, and because of his poor academics, his father pushed him to go to Sandhurst, the military academy. Didn't think he was material for going into the law, going into anything else. We'll put him in the military. And it's an indication of how kind of an average student Winston was. It took him 3 attempts before he finally passed the entrance exam into Sandhurst. So third time's the charm for Churchill. Once he got there, though, actually, he performed pretty well. He graduated 20th in his class out of 120 students. So once he got into school, he did quite well. By this time, his father had died. That was in the 1890s, about the time that Winston graduated from Sandhurst. And Churchill almost immediately got himself leave and a newspaper gig reporting on the insurrection going on in Cuba in the 1890s. This was the Cuban independence insurrection. This is what led to eventually the Spanish-American War in 1898. This is all part of this long, drawn-out fighting that's going on, or was going on in Cuba as they're fighting for their independence. So this shows Winston at his most self-centered and his most self-promoting way. To get leave from the Army, kind of think of it this way. You just get a brand new job, and you go to your boss and say, oh, by the way, I'd like some time off. And that's what Winston did. But because he was the grandson of aristocracy, his mother was very wealthy. Obviously, she had connections. He could kind of get away with some of this stuff that maybe the average person couldn't have gotten away with at that point. So he goes to Cuba as a newspaper correspondent. Shortly after that, he goes to India. That was in 1896. He went to India as both a soldier and a newspaper correspondent. And he wrote his first book called The Story of the Malenkaland Field Force that was published in 1898. Was the first of his more than 40 books. And just parenthetically, about 10 days ago, I went on my Libby app because I was looking for some Churchill biographies to read and prepping for this and refreshing my memory and so forth. And almost all of these books that Churchill wrote in the 1890s, early 1900s and 1890s, at least those that are on Libby, the library app that I'm sure many of you use, there was a waiting list for them. Yeah, and I sat there over my cup of coffee in the morning going exactly what the woman in the front row just said. You're kidding me, really? These books that are 130 years old, there's a waiting list to get these things? But at any rate, there's a waiting list. And also, by all accounts, Churchill was a good writer, and most of his books got really good reviews. I would say maybe the Nobel Prize in Literature was sort of, because he had led the country and maybe not not saying it wasn't good history, but he was Winston Churchill, so that might have had something to do with it. But still, most of his works got really good reviews. So after India, he goes to, gets himself assigned to Egypt under Lord Kitchener. And in Egypt, he was part of Kitchener's campaign for the British trying to capture the Sudan, or what becomes, or is Sudan. So he's part of those battles, and he writes another book about that. And that book also came out in it came out in 1899, and it was called The River War. And it discusses Kitchener's campaign in Africa. So by the fall of 1899, keep in mind, he's not yet 25 years old. And he's got 2 books, and he's got a little bit of national fame because he's written a lot of newspaper articles. And so he resigns his commission and decides to run for Parliament. And I think that's any 25, 26-year-old who runs for national office has got to have a little bit of an ego, okay? For better or worse. You've got to have a little bit of an ego to want to do that at that age. But he loses. So then he manages, again, through connections, he manages to get himself appointed as a correspondent for a London newspaper to go cover the Boer War in South Africa. And it's in the Boer War that he really makes a name for himself and becomes a national figure. He manages, that's him and his wife, we'll get to them in a moment. The Boer War, and he manages to get himself captured by the Boers. And then he manages to escape the capture and has this harrowing journey. It's kind of like planes, trains, and automobiles across South Africa to get to safety. And he goes home, and of course, what does Winston Churchill do? Because he is a prolific writer, he writes not 1 book, but 2 books about his experiences in South Africa. He also, this is one of those instances where, there's some gray area here, because Churchill was technically a war correspondent, but when he was captured, he was carrying a pistol, which was kind of a no-no for that. And then later on, some people claimed that Churchill claimed he was an officer because he heard there was going to be a prisoner exchange. And if he were an officer, he would get exchanged, but as a newspaper correspondent, he'd be stuck in prison. Whatever happened, we don't know. We do know, as I said, that he wrote 2 books about it. It propelled him into really national fame, even worldwide fame at this point. And again, he's 26, 27 years old. And the second thing we know is that he was taking people to court for about 2 decades who tried to discredit his story about what happened in South Africa. All the way up until about World War I, he was suing people for libel if they contradicted his story about what had happened in Africa. So he returns to Britain, now a hero. 1900, he's elected to Parliament for the first time. And he is elected to Parliament. Within a few years, he is named Home Secretary, or excuse me, sorry, trying to get the exact title here. It was like the Assistant Home Secretary, and I'm not seeing the precise title in my notes here. At any rate, he's elected to Commons. That's the key. A couple years later, he is elevated to a low-level cabinet position when he's about 30 years old. And at this point, in 1904, 1905, he switches parties. And this is another sort of piece of evidence of his self-centeredness, his willingness to sort of what track is best for me in the moment, and so forth. So in Britain at the time, there were two main parties. There were the Conservatives and there were the Liberals. Now it's a crude comparison, but just think the Republican Party in America 30 years ago and the Democratic Party in America 30 years ago. That's kind of where those parties were, just for a rough comparison. And if any of you are political scientists out there, I apologize. You're probably cringing at that comparison. But for our purposes, think of it like that. Okay, that's what the parties kind of believed in. Churchill had never been completely comfortable with the Conservatives, which is where he was initially elected. His family had always been part of the Conservative Party, so I think to some degree it was one of those things where it's what my family did, so I'm just going to do the exact same thing. My parents were conservative, so I'm conservative. He was never comfortable. So he switches to the Liberal Party, and he stays in the Liberal Party for about 20 years. And then in the 1920s, he flips back again and goes to the Conservative Party. Churchill's detractors at this point, especially by the 20s and 30s, were saying, you can't trust the guy. He's a flip-flopper, right? He's just whichever way the wind blows, he's going to go that way, is their criticism of him. I don't think that's a fair criticism. As I said, he was never really comfortable with the Conservatives. His ideology would have been like on the liberal side of the conservative spectrum or the conservative side of the liberal spectrum, okay? So once he makes this switch, he allies himself with David Lloyd George, a name that might ring some bells with some of you. David Lloyd George, at this point, is a member of Parliament, but from 1916 until 1922, he was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and he led Britain in the last half of World War I. He was a decade or so older than Churchill, and they really had sort of a mentor-mentee relationship, and Churchill kind of attaches himself to Lloyd George's coattails at this point. And together, they create, in Great Britain, one of the first modern welfare states in the Western world. Churchill and Lloyd George, as members of Parliament, spearheaded the creation of what today we would call welfare state, liberal democracy, what have you. I mentioned Social Security a few minutes ago in my opening remarks, but they also created health insurance for everyone in Great Britain, for workers. They passed unemployment benefits funded by contributions from workers, employers, and the government. They created a workmen's compensation law in 1906. They set minimum wages in certain industries. They created free meals for school children. And the last thing I'll mention is they also created medical inspections in schools during this time. For a lot of those things, like Social Security, unemployment benefits, and workman's comp, and minimum wages, all of those things, that was about 30-ish years before it happened. Any of those things happened in the United States. And those only happened in the United States because of the Great Depression. Okay? They come along, they're part of the New Deal. Would they have come along without the New Deal? Yeah, maybe, but definitely not as quickly or in the way they did during the New Deal. So Churchill is responsible, along with Lloyd George and a couple of others, with implementing those reforms and pushing them through the House of Commons and the parliamentary procedures in Great Britain. It was during this period, also in 1908, that Churchill married his wife, Clementine Hosier, in September of 1908. They remained married for 57 years until his death in 1964. Together, there are pictures of her as a young woman and as a much older lady there. She passed away in 1978, so she lived about 14 years after, or longer than Churchill did. She was a little bit younger than he was also. At any rate, they were married for 57 years. Together they had 5 children, one of whom died of sepsis as a 2 or 3-year-old. The others all lived into adulthood. By all accounts, they had a very loving marriage, except when he ignored her advice. And there is unlike his parents, there has never been any whiff of him having affairs, of him having mistresses, anything like that. Some of his biographers have argued that because his parents' sexual desires had been so detrimental to his family and to his childhood that he had almost a prudish view of sex and sexuality. Although if you read some of his biographies, he also loved, if it was his house, his attitude was, if it's my house, I should be able to run around with whatever the heck I want on, which was often nothing. And there were stories of maids who would see Winston like at the top of the stairs screaming at them to get something, and he had no clothes on. There was also a story when he was in the White House. He was running down the hallway with no clothes on, and Eleanor gasped. And Churchill said something like, "Haven't you ever seen a naked rear end before?" Or as he was scooting down the hallway, something like that. At any rate, there was never any, as I said, never any indication that Churchill had mistresses, was promiscuous, was always faithful to Clementine, which in that day and age, in that level of British society, was kind of a rarity. Really, as well. So they were married in 1908. By 1911, he was made First Lord of the Admiralty, which is the British equivalent of the Secretary of the Navy, back when there was a Secretary of the Navy that was a cabinet-level position. And he was he was First Lord of the Admiralty until 1915, when he was forced to resign. We'll talk about that in a second. There's Churchill with 2 of his children, his son Randolph and daughter Diana, taken in 1923. That was just about the time the last of his children was born. I think the last of their children was born in 1922, so Randolph was his oldest son. And as First Lord of the Admiralty, Churchill worked really hard to kind of upgrade and professionalize the Navy. He saw World War I coming, and one of the causes of World War I, one of many causes of World War I, was a naval race between the Germans and the British. And Churchill stepped in and really tried to negotiate that down, was working to try to, de-escalate the arms race, the Navy race with Imperial Germany, and obviously he failed. He also worked to upgrade and professionalize the services that were available to men in the Navy. Here we see a picture of Churchill and Kaiser Wilhelm. And notice that last sentence there, they were distant cousins. Churchill is also, when you stop and think, first response is, well, how is that, But when you kind of stop and think about it, if you know anything about British history, British aristocracy, Churchill is, the younger son of the aristocracy, so he's on the fringes of the aristocracy. and the aristocracy is largely intermarried. If you go back far enough, pretty much everybody in the aristocracy at some point has some common relative. You know, it might be 300-400 years ago, but they've got some common relative. So it's not surprising. So because he's related to the Kaiser, who was Queen Victoria's grandson, that also makes him a distant cousin of who? Queen Victoria, and bring that forward a few generations, King Charles. Okay, he is a distant cousin of King Charles as well. And also on separate sides of the family, he was also a distant cousin of Princess Diana. Okay, his Churchill's middle name was Spencer, and that was also her maiden name, Diana Spencer. So I'm not sure how far back that goes, but he's distant cousins with the current royal family. At any rate, here he is in 1906 with Kaiser Wilhelm and maneuvers. So in 1914, as the war is on the brink of happening, Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, takes a bold step and starts to mobilize the British Navy a couple days before war is actually declared. And that turns out to be a really fortuitous move by him, because it gives the British a little bit of a heads up, or head start, I should say, in mining some of the North Sea, creating sea lanes that the British ships could move through, that the German submarines would have trouble navigating through, and also got the wheels in process to move about 120,000 British troops of the British Expeditionary Force, or the BEF, across the English Channel to France and Belgium as the war is beginning. And those couple of days are really crucial. If you studied World War I, or maybe remember your World War I history from high school or college, it was a pretty close thing there in August and September of 1914, and the Germans were within 30 or 40 miles of Paris. So every British trooper that was there that was offering any resistance was helping the cause. So that was a really key thing that Churchill gets a lot of credit for doing. The war quickly turns into a stalemate, and at that point, he begins to advocate for this operation in the Dardanelles, or Gallipoli. You see the Gallipoli Peninsula here and the Dardanelles. I have to ask you to use just a little bit of an imagination here. Okay, just imagine a little bit more than I have on this map. I like this map because it gives you the real close-up, but it kind of misses a little bit of the bigger picture. Turkey here is fighting against Great Britain. Turkey is, at that point, it's called the Ottoman Empire, and it's allied with Germany and Austria-Hungary. And so Churchill's plan was that the Allies should capture the Dardanelles and then capture Istanbul, which would be up here. I need to be 6 feet tall instead of 5'9" to reach that point, but you get the gist. Knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, and then that would relieve pressure on Russia, which is way up on top in the ceiling there. That's where I'm asking you to use a little imagination of where Russia would be on that map. So it makes sense. It makes strategic sense from the perspective of the British. The Dardanelles campaign, without going into details, was a complete and utter disaster for the Allies. In total, something like 250,000 casualties. It was a horrible, horrible defeat for the British. One of the worst defeats in British military history. It plays out over several months. By the fall of 1915, the British government is forced to dissolve itself. The prime minister at that time was a guy named Asquith. He's forced out of office, and the conservatives are now saying, we're going to form a government, and one of the conditions is that we want Churchill gone. We don't want to work with him. He's got to out of here. So Churchill was forced to resign over the Dardanelles and the Gallipoli campaign in the Dardanelles. and that was largely what caused the Asquith government to fall as well. So Churchill was really scapegoated. Did he have some of the blame for this? Yeah, absolutely. Was he the sole cause of it? Absolutely not. The commanders on the ground were making the day-to-day decisions that were leading to this slaughter. It wasn't Churchill back in London who was making these daily decisions that was leading to the slaughter of so many British and Commonwealth troops. And in fact, later on, there was a commission. Parliament, just like Congress, had to create a commission to investigate what happened. And the commission totally exonerated Churchill of any wrongdoing or any malfeasance in this. But he was the public face, so he was forced out. And he is forced out of the government, but in the British parliamentary system, he's still a member of Parliament. He's still in Parliament. But Churchill says, well, to heck with that. I was a graduate of Sandhurst. I'm joining the Army. And so in late 1915, 1916, Churchill stays in Parliament, but he goes off into the Army. He's made a lieutenant colonel, and he's given a command. And here we see a picture of Churchill in the middle there with some of his comrades during World War I. He stayed in the trenches in France for about 3 months. He was fighting. By all accounts, there was shelling, daily shelling going on. Certainly there was danger, but they never faced German troops in a frontal assault or, trench warfare or anything like that. It was bad, but it certainly wasn't the worst of what happened in World War I. Some of his biographers say that this was actually only 3 months, but quite a transformative experience for him because he really got to see what the soldiers were experiencing, and some argue that it really impacted his thinking during World War II, and we'll come to that in a few minutes. So he's in the trenches for, as I said, about 3 months, and in the summer of 1917, he was brought back into the government as the Minister of Munitions, in charge of, munitions, as the title would imply. It's in this role that he develops, or he doesn't personally develop, but he promotes the development, gives money to the development of the tank. So Churchill is, I wouldn't say the father of the tank, so to speak, like, Henry Ford's the father of modern automobiles, but Churchill certainly played a role in the development of the tank. He saw how bogged down the Western Front was, and he envisioned this big behemoth metal machine thing that could roll over the trenches and wouldn't be stopped by machine gun fire or even light explosives like hand grenades, and can just sort of roll on through and press on through. So he, this was part of from his experiences in the trenches. So he promotes the use of the tank, helps fund it, and at this point he serves, after that he remains in the cabinet until 1922. He serves in a number of positions besides Minister of Munitions. Of course, the war ended, so that position wasn't needed anymore. The one thing I would say here, again, this took some time, years to play out, and this is kind of where some of his race relations comes into play that I mentioned earlier. He actively sought to quell any sort of Indian independence movement that was going on. He had a derisive nickname for Gandhi, which I read it and I can't remember what it was, and I didn't write it down, but he had a dismissive nickname for Gandhi, like LBJ called Robert Kennedy a little pissant. That was usually his comment on Robert Kennedy, kind of like that. So he was opposed to Indian independence. He also supported the Black and Tans in the Irish Civil War that was going on against Irish nationalists, so he was opposed to Irish immigration, or Irish independence. And then lastly, which is very appropriate still, we're dealing with the consequences of this today, Churchill was in charge of the Middle East. One of his portfolios as a cabinet secretary was charge of the Middle East. And he's the one who basically drew up the boundaries of the Middle East that we're still dealing with today. So, you know, as things are never good in the Middle East, it doesn't seem, and at least part of that we can trace back to British colonial policy, and Churchill had his finger right in the middle of all of that going on. On the other hand, you know, the Middle East has been in conflict since when did Cain kill Abel? Like Genesis 2? So it's never been a peaceful region necessarily. So in 1922, he is voted out of office. This was the beginning of his 2 years out of office. Part of the reason he lost was because he had an emergency appendectomy during the middle of the campaign, and one of his more famous quotes at this point was, he said he was without a seat, without a party, and apparently without an appendix. He used these 2 years out of office very productively. He did a lot of writing in this. He had to pay. I mean, remember, he's living beyond his means, and he's got no job. Not that Parliament paid very much, but now he's got nothing, so he's got a right to pay the bills. So he, at this point, buys Chartwell, what becomes the family estate in Kent, south of London. Anybody been there? A few people have. Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful place. The oldest parts of this house date back to like the 1100s. Clearly that structure is newer than that, but some of the inner parts of it are 700-800 years old. Chartwell was a huge place. It took 8 or 9 servants to run, and they had no money. And because Winston was Winston, we'll do this. This is a yes or a no question, okay? Do you think he consulted his wife before he bought it? No. And by everybody laughing, I knew you knew the answer, right? Yeah, he didn't consult his wife. And just for good measure, about the time he bought this is when their 5th and final child was born as well. But he turns Chartwell into, really, he envisions this as sort of his Xanadu, if you will. And he builds ponds there. He has all kinds of animals. He loved animals. They always could never eat any of the chickens that were on the farm or on the estate because he was too attached to them, so he didn't want to know if he had eaten one of his own chickens, and so forth. This was always kind of a money pit for Churchill because he was always doing stuff, always remodeling, always trying to upgrade, in addition to his other expensive habits. And actually, in 1946, after the war, he can't keep it up anymore, and so one of his rich benefactors buys it and then donates it to the country, to the National Trust. Basically makes it into like an American equivalent of a national park. And they say that Winston and Clementine can live there until they die, and then it turns over, and as some of you know, because you've been there, it turns into a tourist place for people to go visit. So he buys this. It's also at this time in the early 20s that he has his first art show. After Gallipoli, 6 or 7 years previously, that was 1915, 1916, he takes up painting and discovers that he's actually pretty good at painting. And he falls under the skilled amateur kind of category, I guess. I play a lot of golf, so he's got a really low handicap. If you're talking golf, he's got a really low handicap. He's pretty good. And so he's painting a lot. That's one of his forms of recreation and letting the tension out, is to paint. And he has his first show in Paris in the early 20s. It's anonymous because he is so famous at this point. And this is an example of one of his watercolors. I'm no art person at all, but it looks pretty good to me. I don't know. I do like Impressionism, and to me that seems like pretty good Impressionism. Again, if you're an art history scholar, I apologize. You're probably appalled at my saying that, but to an amateur, it looks pretty good. So in 1924, he re-enters politics. He is he wins a seat. He's flip-flopped by this point back to the Conservatives, and he wins a seat in Congress, or in the Parliament, and is made Chancellor of the Exchequer, and which is like Secretary of the Treasury. He remains in government until 1929, when the Conservatives are voted out, and he spends the next decade in the British parlance as a backbencher, which means you're out of power. And at this time in the 1930s, he becomes one of the most vocal critics of Adolf Hitler, recognizes the peril that Hitler poses before pretty much anybody else. Everyone thinks he's a warmonger and doesn't really pay much attention to him, which probably should have. Also during this period, he met Mussolini, which came back to haunt him, and he actually praised Mussolini because Mussolini was anti-communist and Churchill was vehemently anti-communist, and so he, at this point, praised Mussolini, which to some degree came back to haunt him a little bit during World War II. As you know, World War II began in September of 1939, and by April of 1940, the British situation was in dire straits. The Prime Minister was a guy named Neville Chamberlain, and it was clear that Chamberlain couldn't continue as Prime Minister. So the government is about to dissolve, and the first choice was to succeed Chamberlain. I remember a little while ago I said Churchill wasn't the first choice. The first choice was a guy named Lord Halifax. But Halifax didn't want the job. So then they went to Winston. He was the second choice. Probably good that Halifax didn't want the job, because Halifax wanted to negotiate a peace with Hitler and the Nazis. And because of that, then Winston sort of banned him, made him ambassador to the United States. So get him the heck out of Britain and let FDR and the Americans worry about him. Get him out of there. And it was during these first inspired months of leadership during World War II that really the legend of Churchill was born. He rallied the country, gave inspiring speeches. It was during this time that he said, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, and tears. One historian has called his speech before the Commons electrifying. And here we see it, Churchill obviously on the left, and that's King George. On the right, that would be the grandfather of King Charles, the father of Elizabeth there. And Churchill's quote, I hope you can read that. It was hard getting it to see. It says, "I felt that my entire life had been in preparation for this hour and this trial," he said later on after taking over the realm, or the helm, I should say. So he gave a number of electrifying speeches. I'm going to quote just one of them. This might sound familiar to you. He says, "We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields, in the streets. We shall fight in the hills, and we will never surrender." Throughout the war, he worked with Roosevelt very closely. They exchanged letters or telegrams at a pace of about 2 communications every 3 days throughout the war. So it gives you a sense of how often they were in touch. His later war leadership comes under criticism. Pretty much everybody agrees those first year or so when he rallied Britain through the Battle of Britain, when he was seen walking through the bombed out streets of London. He really rallies the troops, but his later leadership comes under question because some said he was meddling, too meddling. Some say that he had favorites among commanding officers who really weren't as good as they should have been. The two names that are most often brought up in this context are Field Marshal Montgomery, one of the most famous British commanders of the war, and also Lord Mountbatten also is frequently criticized, but they were kind of favorites of Churchill, so they stayed in power. So the last thing about World War II that I'll mention is, and this is where the experience of the Dardanelles comes into play and his experience in the trenches. He was really reluctant to commit to a cross-channel invasion of Germany, of northern France. And the Americans were pushing and pushing, and Churchill was doing everything he could to prevent that from happening. He continued to make all kinds of arguments against the cross-channel attack. And in November of 1943, at the Tehran conference with FDR and Stalin, Roosevelt basically maneuvers him into a corner and gets him to a point where he couldn't say no to a cross-channel invasion. Okay, Roosevelt was fed up with Churchill at this point. American commanders were fed up with Churchill at this point, so they maneuvered him into a corner to agree to the cross-channel invasion. So in 1945, as the war was winding down, Churchill was voted out of office. Britain held up an election. They hadn't had an election in a decade, and Churchill was voted out of office. And again, he remained in Parliament, but he was no longer Prime Minister. He was 71 years old. He was exhausted. And his wife said to him that maybe this was a blessing in disguise, that he was no longer Prime Minister, to which Churchill responded, "It's quite well hidden." Whatever the blessing was quite well hidden. He didn't see it. Churchill, by this point, was 71, as I said. His health was not great. He had had at least one heart attack during World War II. In fact, that happened when he was living in the White House in late 41, 42, pretty much right after Pearl Harbor. He jumped on a boat and got over here to get Roosevelt's ear, and that was when I guess Eleanor saw him running naked through the White House as well. It was at that point that he had a heart attack. He also had a couple of really severe bouts of pneumonia during the war, and he traveled more than 100,000 miles during the war, a lot of it by air. And keep in mind, planes at that point didn't fly above at altitude. You know, they could only fly at 10, 12,000 feet. It was bumpy, it was loud, and no matter the time of year, it was cold flying up at that height. So 100,000 miles isn't like the president today jumping on Air Force One and having, you know, the whole White House basically right there, and beds and showers and everything like that. Nothing nearly that elaborate. He was offered to be made the Duke of Dover by the king. He said no to that. He said instead, this is brilliant, this is absolutely brilliant. He said, "I don't want to be made a peer. I want to keep all of my papers from World War II," which is, you know, semi-loads of papers. And so he had access to all of his papers when he was writing the 7-volume history of World War II, or 6-volume history of World War II. He had all of his papers right there. And to say he wrote it is also a little bit of a stretch, because he had a team of people who would write stuff and he would edit and then tell them what else to do, and they would bring him pages and he would edit and put stuff in his own voice. But he was not the lonely writer sitting there at his typewriter pounding away, you know, fetching cups of coffee to stay awake and do all of that stuff. He had a team. So he served another 20 years. He was Prime Minister one more time in the early 50s. There we see him with the big three at Yalta. FDR is clearly a very ill man in that photo. Here we see him with Queen Elizabeth and Prince Charles and Princess Anne, or Princess Royal Anne, as little kids. During this second term of Prime Minister, most accounts say he only became Prime Minister because King George was really sick, then he died. Queen Elizabeth really didn't have the political clout yet to feel like she could kick this icon, this national hero, out of office. And the next person in line, a guy named Anthony Eden, was also sick. So Churchill kind of was the last guy standing, so to speak, in all of this. And he ultimately passed away in 1964 at 90 years old. I kind of raced through there. About 10 minutes ago, I realized, holy cow, I'm almost out of time. So I raced. I apologize for that. I was having too much fun talking about everything else. At any rate, though, does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
A couple of things. One is that is the result.
So I think everyone heard that, but just in case you didn't, gentleman said the photographer took Winston's cigar away, and that's why he was looking so angry at this point. Great. Oh, go ahead.
Just a quick thing. We took a wonderful tour along Normandy, seeing the beaches.
So those were the mulberries, and I wish I knew you were going to mention it. Somewhere in my PowerPoints, I've got pictures of those in Normandy. Yeah, they're still there. So I saw this gentleman's hand, and I'll come back to you. Yeah, they were, I think, fed up with his leadership. They were fed up with the war. I think those are the two biggest things. About to win, yeah. And I think in this, as a fellow historian, you may or may not appreciate this. I think they were just sort of tired of his shtick at that point and wanted change. And you know, and now on a more serious note, it had been a decade since the last election. And Churchill had been leading a coalition that came together in 1940 because of the war. And so people felt like, been there long enough, we need some new blood, new ideas. So hope that answers your question. I see two hands here, but this gentleman I saw first, and then I'll come back to you two folks.
A comment and a question. The comment was you didn't mention that
His constituency moved around. Initially, he was in Dundee, which is actually in Scotland, I believe. Yeah, and then he served actually 3 different constituencies. The British, unlike our system, you don't really have to live somewhere to serve that district. So initially it was Scotland, and then it was 2 districts, I believe, in the London area. Specifically, I can't say like the 5th district of Massachusetts or whatever. So a couple of other questions here. Yes, sir. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that was, if you didn't hear that, another story about his nakedness. He was sitting there naked, and FDR walked in, and Churchill said, "I've got nothing to hide." So I think, sir, did you have your hand up?
one of the things that people mention is he's egocentric.
You know, the name that comes to mind right away, who's not, although in general, yes, I agree with you 100%. The one name that comes to mind, though, is someone who I don't think was very egocentric, was Calvin Coolidge. That would be my one guess at that, because he was pretty laid back and whatever. But in general, you are absolutely right. You know, everybody in politics, you've got to have a big ego. You've got to be able to take criticism and whatever. So you're right. let's see, I'll go over here, and then the woman here, and then the gentleman in the red shirt. We'll work around.
I don't think they've given enough credit for.
Yeah. As I think I said at the start, I can't imagine what the world would be like if Churchill had not been prime minister. You know, it would be very different. Yeah, you're absolutely.
Never would have done it.
No. Well, and Chamberlain died, and that was one of the reasons. He had cancer, was why he stepped down. So that was probably part of why he failed leadership, was just his illness. So, but yeah, clearly without Churchill, ask rhetorically, where would we be if Germany had defeated Britain? Or even if Britain had been neutral. I don't see the United States beating Germany for a long time if Britain is out of the war and either neutral or defeated. So, the woman on the aisle here. Oh, you had to ask a question that I really don't know the answer to. No, they met. What I do know is she came from kind of aristocracy, a lot of wealth. They met about 4 years before they got married for the first time, and then they connected again a couple of years later, and were engaged and married within a few months of when they finally got together. Some money, yeah. I forget. I actually anticipated this question, and I did a little reading on this. Yeah, she came from some money, not really in the British aristocracy, but some wealth at least. And okay, I'll mark that down. Gentleman in the red shirt, and then I saw gentleman in the T-shirt. Yeah, and if you didn't hear that, George Washington is another great example of someone who didn't have a lot of ego, probably, or at least not the sort of politician's ego, let's call it. And yeah, when Churchill was a young officer, he, as you said, read voraciously to make up for what he recognized as his deficits from his education. When he was in India and Egypt and Cuba and so forth, during that decade or so, he was just a voracious reader, reading everything he could get his hands on. Yeah, it's always easier when you've got cooks and cleaners and all of that stuff. John, you look very familiar to me, sir. Okay, that's why. Well, first of all, I think Churchill was, for the most part, yeah. This is the opposite. Most of the time it's turn out the lights, the party's over. Now it's turn on the lights, the party's over. Yeah, exactly. Thank you.